BYU basketball gets 2 wins against top 25 Blue Bloods. Was it the most impressive week in BYU basketball history? Plus, is Kansas just not that good? And what's it going to take for the Cougars to run the table? We're talking about it coming up on the Loyal Cougars podcast. Hello and welcome to the Loyal Cougars podcast. I'm your host, Jake Edmonds, joined today by Jake 1.0, Jake Hatch. Welcome to the show, Jake. It's been a long time, I feel like.
It's been a minute, but good to be back. Hope everybody's doing well out there in Cougar Boardville, I guess I should say. And obviously, thanks for having me back on the podcast.
Yeah, man. So you just brought this up. I haven't been following the news on this, but it sounds like there's been a change up north, and this is a BYU podcast, but this is going to impact BYU to some extent. Craig Smith reportedly out at Utah. Correct. As head coach. Very short stint with the Utes, it feels like. I think he was only there for 2 years coming out of Utah State.
3 seasons, I believe it all.
Yeah. Very short. So how does this impact BYU? Let's just get first impressions real quick.
Well, number one thing is you can already put Chris Burgess on a short list of candidates to take over for Craig Smith up there at Utah. The other thing is whoever takes over that job, Jake, is going to obviously be pointing south and saying, hey, you see what BYU's doing in NIL? I need that to succeed myself. So that's my initial impression, is that BYU is kind of the standard bearer for what Utah is going to try to measure up to when it comes to hiring a new basketball coach.
Yeah, and I feel like that only is going to intensify if it is Chris Burgess, because he's experiencing it firsthand, right? He knows what Kevin Young has brought to the table in terms of NIL. Now, granted, I think Kevin Young has more resources than Utah has, and BYU's got definitely deeper pockets as far as NIL money coming in. But if it is someone like a Chris Burgess, he knows what BYU has done, and he's going to try and emulate that as much as possible if he goes to Utah. Now, granted, we're just speculating, right? This is very, very initial impression, so who knows what's going to happen? But there's a real possibility. Plus, BYU still plays Utah this season, and so I think BYU fans and BYU players and coaches have been penciling that game since they lost in Salt Lake City.
Correct.
And so, I think it's any sort of turmoil, and we'll talk about turmoil with Arizona State because they've got their own turmoil coming up this week. But, any sort of turmoil you introduce to a team, is it going to divide or is it going to bring the locker room together? That'll be interesting to watch over the next couple of weeks, and especially when Utah heads to Provo to play BYU.
Well, and that's the thing about this is you're going to look at the payback element to all of this. Obviously, there's that in that March 8th game. But the other thing is it's going to be an interesting environment. How is Utah going to be looking with now that obviously there's 4 games to go? This news, literally, Jake and I sat down to record this. This came down 5 minutes before we sat down to record. So it is fresh as the headlines come. But it is going to make for an interesting environment. What will the Utes look like? Will they be disillusioned? Will they be trying to play for whoever the interim is? I actually don't even know who the interim has been named yet, if they have done that. So there is so much going into that final game, but let's just put it this way. BYU's got to win that game, and they should do so convincingly now.
Yeah, and we'll talk about their future schedule coming up. But I do want to start with just what happened last week, because going into last week, I had Tosh on the show. And honestly, we were saying best case scenario, or at least what you want to hope for is a 1-1 week. Either beat Kansas or beat Arizona State on the road. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect BYU to beat both teams. And to be honest, Kansas wasn't even close. Obviously, we know that. And we can talk about how good Kansas actually is. Are they really a top 25 team? The AP polls came out today, and this is the first week in a long time that they're not a top 25 team. And BYU jumps in the top 25 at number 25. But, what impressed you the most this week, Jake, as you watch BYU play home against Kansas and play at Arizona?
Well, just kind of showing that this team is coming together and peaking at the right time. You talk about wanting to have a team that's ready to rock and roll come March. Well, when you go in, if I'm not mistaken, I saw this on social media. So if I'm wrong about this, please let me know. But it was the first time BYU notched back-to-back top 25 upsets in the same week since 1988. I was 1 year old the last time this happened. So historic stuff for this BYU basketball team. And I'm really impressed just with the fight and the overall cohesiveness of this BYU squad. We see too often that you see rosters and rotations get cut down as the season progresses, Jake. We have seen it actually expand at BYU, and it's been to their benefit. Trey Stewart, Mihailo Bošković, they have been absolutely important cogs in powering this 4-0 streak for BYU. And it's crazy to think where they're at versus where they were, but this past week, that is really, really impressive stuff. And the nice part is you're getting contributions from across this roster. It's not just one guy doing it and dragging the rest of the guys along for the ride.
Yeah, and I think that's the best part of what we're witnessing is that Kevin Young has shown, it seems like in college basketball, coaches kind of fixate on their rotation. And once they've established a rotation, like that's who they're going with for the remainder of the season. Now, granted, guys can get hurt, guys can get kicked off the team, as we've seen at Arizona State. But for the most part, coaches seem to kind of stick with who they've got. And Kevin Young has really shown the ability to really play with his lineup still. And like normally you would look at that and be like, he just doesn't know. Like he still doesn't know like who his lineup is. But the reality is like Kevin Young has found a way to utilize the best players at the best moments of a game. And Dallin Hall, I think, is a perfect example because Dallin's a guy that we've seen struggle really throughout the whole year, especially, you know, early on in conference play, right? Like he wasn't himself. He wasn't the Dallin that we expected or that we had seen last year. And Kevin Young has found a way to put him in lineups where he can succeed and also put him in moments of games. And the Arizona game is a perfect example because, you know, Dallin Hall only had, he was only in for 16 minutes against Arizona. And like, that's not, you know, I think he was in foul trouble a little bit early on, but he utilized those 16 minutes mostly in clutch time. And Dallin essentially was the ball handler in clutch time, where previously, you know, that was Yegor. And I actually thought it was interesting after the game, Coach Young talked about how he learned from the Utah game what to do in that situation where there's 13 seconds on the clock, you're down one, you need a guy to go get a bucket. Now, granted, he didn't rely on Dallin Hall, but Dallin Hall was part of the play. I think he was the one that actually initiated the press, breaking the press, and then he handed it off to Richie. And Richie was the guy that Kevin Young went to get that bucket. Now, granted, he got fouled and scored the 2 free throws, but against Utah, do you remember who that was?
It was
Yegor.
Oh, Yegor. You're right. Yeah. Okay. Good point. I had forgotten about that. That's a very good point by you to point out that in some ways, Kevin Young was such a neophyte when it came to translating what he knew in the NBA to the college game. But as the season has progressed, you're right. He has figured things out on the fly. And I think doubling down on what you're saying there, he is knowing in the game, hey, we've got this type of scenario. I'm going to put X, Y, and Z players. You mentioned Dallin Hall in this circumstance out there. That's coaching, and that's understanding you've scouted the opponent the right way. You understand what these players' strengths and weaknesses are. And to your point, yeah, Yegor struggled against that. Well, now you pivot, you put Dallin Hall in there to break that press and obviously set things up, and then you just continue to do your thing. And that's what I like about this BYU basketball team right now is that's just one microcosm of multiple of these. Trey Stewart, he had this like patented streak for a couple of games there where he'd come in and hit a 3 late at the end of the first half, and that's all he'd play in the game. Well, guess what? The West Virginia game, they needed him and Mihailo Bošković to come in and provide a spark. That's exactly what they did. So it's been nice to see multiple instances of what you're talking about come to fruition this year.
So speaking of Richie coming in and being the guy, right? Being the guy that, and you know, throughout the whole game, Richie was the guy. But I love that Kevin Young went to Richie for that last play because, again, I think he learned from his mistake of and Yegor's fine. Like I think Yegor's still a great player, but I think Kevin Young learned that Richie's not the guy that you want to have that last possession, and that's fine. Like I think that's a great thing to learn. But you know, everyone complaining about the foul call, and I actually think it's kind of sad that there's so much talk about that one play because the game itself was so good. And, you know, I'll be honest, I think that I wouldn't have called a foul personally. I think if the roles were reversed and that same type of contact was called against BYU, I think BYU fans would be up in arms. And so I don't think there's a ton of like options to defend the foul call. Yes, there was contact. Yes, there was a little bit of a hip check. That's just not a foul that's called in that situation. And honestly, the referee on the baseline didn't call it. Right? Who's the referee that called it?
Tony Padilla, baby. Let's
Our
go.
our guy, Tony Padilla. Tony giveth and Tony taketh away. And and so like, BYU fans would be outraged
Mm-hmm.
if the roles were reversed. Now at the same time, BYU fans were outraged. I thought the previous 2 or 3 possessions with the foul calls that Arizona was getting on the other side. And so I don't it's sad to see the outrage from Arizona fans. Even though I tend to understand in that moment, was the foul correct? Probably not. But like when you look at the game overall, as far as officiating, first of all, I thought it was officiated fairly well. I think you can look at 3 or 4 individual instances and say like, oh, there wasn't a foul on the Caleb Love 3-pointer where he got 3 free throws. I think Keita had 2 fouls. I think sandwiched that 3-pointer. Keita had 2 fouls that I thought were very questionable. I thought he went up in the air, hands up in the air. But like, it's so sad to point to an individual play or an individual call or no call and say like that BYU fans should be embarrassed, or BYU should be embarrassed for that win, because the reality is they scored 96 points in McHale Center for the first time. That's the most that any team has scored since BYU did it the last time with Jimmer, right?
Yes.
So like, that should be what we're talking about. And I hate that we have to talk about the foul call and also the chants after the game.
Well, okay, and let me insert one thing. I love Tommy Lloyd as a coach because you heard him talk about. He said, "I thought it was a bad call, but they told me this is the Big 12. They told me this guy's the best referee." Which you and I both kind of, I think, are of the same mind that Tony Padilla, if he's the best that we got in college basketball officiating, we need to raise our standards a bit. But that's beside the point. He finished off by saying, we shouldn't have put ourselves in that situation. We allowed them to score 94 points on us before that. That can't happen. And a rundown here, you did the homework on this. Jimmer Fredette scored 49 points, which is a McHale Center record in 2009 as BYU won that game. He scored 49 points in that game. It was 90 whatever points in the win for BYU. But then 258 games since that 2009 game, they'd never given up that many points again, and BYU does it again. Yeah, that's a failure on Arizona's part. But to your point, we're talking about a foul, and now obviously there were some derogatory chants directed at BYU and the LDS Church.
Yeah, and I actually, so I tend to not, I try to not get offended over things that don't, physically hurt me, right? So
Yeah.
it's like to me they're words. What I think is baffling is that first of all on the Arizona side, and granted these are fans, they're going to say what fans say. But fans are defending it, saying that like you're gonna get that animosity in every sort of visiting arena. Like that's pretty common. Like go to a Duke game or go to a North Carolina game, you're gonna hear the same thing. I think as a fan, I would be fine if home fans of opposing teams said F BYU or F this player, F this coach. When you bring a religion into it, I think you introduce this completely different realm of inappropriateness, and I think that's what merits the apology, and that's what that's why there's this national media attention, because you bring religion into it. And I think yes, fans will be fans will say the F word. Like I don't think that's a big deal. It's when you bring religion into it and talk about F Mormons that then I have a problem. Again, I'm not personally offended by it. I am baffled at the fact that Arizona fans and maybe some other fans are defending it for what it is. I don't think and they can say like, oh, BYU players instigated it at the handshake line. It's like that doesn't matter. Like it doesn't matter what they said at the handshake line. They're not chanting F this religion. Like it doesn't merit what you did.
Yeah, and so the thing is, you and I grew up. We're closer in age. We're not obviously the same age. I remember Wyoming, and this was brought up. I saw in some of the discourse online. Well, Wyoming's been doing that for years to BYU. To your point, Jake. There's a very direct difference here. Wyoming said FBYU. It was directed at the institution itself. It was not directed at the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which has been the issue of late with the Providence game, USC, Oregon in the past 4 or 5 years. It's F the Mormons, which attacks a religious class. And I'm with you. It doesn't necessarily bug me individually because like you, I think it's just words, but it brings religion into the conversation. And that's where it gets a little iffy in my world. So the bigger point to be made is, yeah, if you want to direct your derogatory chants at BYU, make it at BYU, not at a full religion of close to 18 million people worldwide now.
Yeah, let's be honest. Wyoming can say whatever they want. No one's going to hear them. That's the reality. They can say F whoever they want, and like no one's going to care because it's Wyoming.
Well, let's just put it this way. I've been to a Wyoming game when they were doing it, and it was kids, grandmas, it was in unison, and I was like, wow, this is astounding. This is everybody. But your point is well made that it is Wyoming.
Yeah. No one cares. So before we finish this segment, I did want to talk about Kevin Young and his out of timeout plays because this was pointed out on Cougar board. Cyclone Coug said BYU stats out of timeouts last night. He said BYU went 3 of 4 from 3, 5 of 5 from 2, 2 of 2 from the free throw line. They had 1 turnover, 2 dunks, and 21 points. Like, that's staggering. And in a game that comes down to free throws, a 1-point game that comes down to free throws, like I think that's massive. And I wanted to point out some of the after timeout plays in crunch time specifically because I don't want to go through all of them. But the plays I really liked were there was one play where this is where Keita dunked it and fell on the ground. He landed on his butt after dunking it. So he sets a screen, he rolls to the hoop. The Arizona defender then switches off on him. But what he does is to get the Arizona defense confused, he fakes this pin down screen on Trevin Knell and slips to the basket. And credit Yegor for finding him, right? He still had to fit it into a tight window. He finds him and he dunks it and then falls on his butt. Great play call. Next timeout, Keita sets a pin down for Knell. It's a quick, easy pin down. Knell gets a quick release from the 3-point line and puts BYU up 87-83. Then BYU they're up 2 with under a minute to go. Arizona's pressing. BYU breaks the press. Dallin finds Richie, whose defender is he's playing too high. So Richie's in the corner. His defender's up too high. I think he's just trying to help a little bit out on Dallin. Dallin immediately finds Richie. I love his decisiveness to find Richie, and Richie blows by him. This is for the and 1 layup, right, to put him up 4. He missed the free throw, put him up 4. Then obviously we know the last play, which was the foul for him to make free throws at the end. But whether it's play calling or whether it's just strictly execution, I thought coming out of timeouts, BYU was dialed in, and that was huge in that game.
Well, and it kind of goes back to what we were talking a little bit earlier. Earlier this season, after timeout stuff was an issue for BYU. They weren't executing it well. I don't think they're necessarily drawn up great. But the nice part is, to what you're talking about here, we're seeing progression in all facets, both as the coaching, speaking of the coaching staff, and with the players themselves. Because yes, Kevin Young can draw up the most incredible after timeout play, an ATO, as they like to call them, and if the players don't execute it, it looks like garbage. So all facets have to be working together, and they were working together in that game against Arizona, most notably, because you're right. They don't win the game without some of those big plays. And the nice part is, both Yegor and Dallin in particular, in terms of initiating things, very decisive and knew exactly where they were going with the basketball.
Yeah. And it's crazy to think that was the second game of 2 top 25 wins against blue blood teams. We're going to talk about the Kansas game because I think that game was, honestly, potentially more impressive. Now, granted, Kansas is no longer in the top 25, and so maybe not. And the reality is, like, we have to ask the question, is Kansas just not good? And we're going to answer that coming up on the Loyal Cougars podcast. This episode is brought to you by Aptiv. Aptiv believes that every home should be enjoyed. They tailor their pest control treatment plans to target pests when and where they're most active. Plus, if you see pest activity between treatments, Aptiv will return and take care of the problem at no additional cost. It's their way of making sure every customer is satisfied and every pest is controlled. If pests stay away, Aptiv is why. Visit goaptiv.com/loyalcougars or call 844-966-4787 and mention this promotion to get your initial treatment for just $29. That's goaptiv.com/loyalcougars or call 844-966-4787. Terms and conditions apply. Get home field advantage with Aptiv. Why should you have to choose between style and repping your team? Wooden Grail is bridging the gap between modern fashion and college fandom. Their hats and apparel are made with premium materials like suede and corduroy, featuring bold, unique designs that let you show off your team pride without sacrificing your look. Whether you're at the game or out on the town, Wooden Grail lets you do both. Check them out at woodengrail.com and step up your fan game. Use code CougarBoard for free shipping on any order. So BYU blew out Kansas by 34. A very historic win in the sense that, Kansas doesn't lose by that much. BYU doesn't beat top 25 teams by that much typically. The last time it happened was against Oregon on a neutral floor a few years ago. And so, after that Kansas win, I think BYU fans were, to the moon, with that win. And I think regardless of what would have happened in that Arizona game, BYU fans would have been happy with the results or the outcome of this week. Now, Arizona just put it over the top. But why did BYU, in your opinion, why were they able to have so much success? And I you can say it's because they were at home. I think that played a factor, but there was way more to it than that.
The thing about it is Kansas, they're not playing the way that you would have expected. This is a team that seems to be being crushed by the weight of expectations on that squad. They just don't look like they're enjoying themselves. Whereas BYU, you can tell they're growing into the season. They're embracing everything that's coming with this as they kind of continue to see their star burn brighter and brighter. And it came to a head as BYU's offense was absolutely electric that night. They were making big shot after big shot, and it buried Kansas. And I said it on my podcast, Jake, shortly after that game went final, that at halftime, usually when you got teams are walking off the court, when it's so one-sided, you can kind of feel there's, and I don't know how to describe it. It's just other than a feel, you can kind of see body language of teams walking off the court and say, okay, that's a team that's going to come out and make a push in the second half. We'll see what happens. And there's other times, like what we saw with Kansas, you can tell that they're like, yeah, we're done here. And they were cooked at halftime, and BYU absolutely smoked them. It was the biggest loss for Kansas against an unranked opponent since before the AP poll era, which started in 1948. It's tied for the biggest loss that Bill Self has ever absorbed as head coach of Kansas. We're talking, it was a monumental upset for BYU, and one that, Arizona game was impressive, but in many respects, that Kansas game gets lost in the shuffle because it's the recency bias, but we should not forget how dominant BYU was against the Jayhawks.
Yeah, and you mentioned shooting. I actually, I look back at the stats. It was an above average shooting game, but definitely not BYU's best.
Okay.
And so, I agree that coming out of that game, it felt like BYU could not miss from three. Yeah. They shot 39%, which is good. That's anything above 35, 36, that's you're going to win a game, right? That's how you win. But they won by 34, Jake. And if you told me that they shot 39% from three, I would have said, yeah, they probably won the game. I would not have expected them to win by 34 and be up 20 at halftime, right? So I don't, and they were 56% from two, or from the field. Sorry, from the field. So yes, they shot well. No, they did not shoot. I thought they shot better against. Was it Baylor?
Baylor, they were shooting. Yeah, you're right. The shooting numbers.
I think Cincinnati at home. I thought they had way better shooting nights.
I think the difference in that Kansas game was the timeliness of the big shots that came. Remember, they were like a three that was like a dagger. It was just kind of would break the back of Kansas in a big moment where it felt like Kansas may finally make a push, and then you'd have a guy come down the court and make a big three. I can't think of one in particular. That's kind of my memory of it. You're right. I was looking at this too. The stats don't necessarily say it was a BYU was shooting outside their minds, but I think it's more the timeliness and the playmaking that was happening in that game, and they just buried Kansas, and the Jayhawks rolled over and died.
Yeah, which begs the question now, because Kansas lost to Utah, right? They lost to Utah the Saturday before, and so and they've been terrible. So let me just go through real quick their splits, and I actually think part of this is because there's such a discrepancy between how they play at home and how they play on the road. So when you're looking at their road schedule, they're averaging 68 points a game while allowing 70. By the way, when they're at home, they're averaging 81 points a game. There's a 13-point discrepancy between their home games and their road games. They're 13-2 at home. They're 3-7 on the road. And like, yeah, you could say, yeah, I mean, that's pretty expected. Everyone is better at home than they are on the road. This is a massive discrepancy. Like, we thought BYU struggled on the road. Kansas is terrible on the road. And, to be quite honest, like their big wins this year were Duke in Vegas and at home against Iowa State. They don't have a marquee win outside of that. And, you could look at BYU and say, well, BYU's only marquee wins are Arizona on the road and Kansas at home. But like, Kansas was a top 25 team. They were the preseason number one. Like, the expectations on Kansas were so high this year, and they've come out and proven to be a middle of the pack Big 12 team.
And the thing about it is, you look at it, this is a team I mentioned earlier, they seem like they're being crushed by the weight of expectations. We all know what Kansas basketball, the history of it means. And there's now the reports are Barry Trammell from the Tulsa World is saying that that Bill Self entertained maybe taking over at Oklahoma State this past year. Now that's been refuted by Bill Self and Kansas, and I understand why you would refute that. But the bigger point to be made here is, I'm not sure that Kansas is what we expected them to be. They obviously always bring in high-level talent, and that I think that adds to kind of Kansas should be Kansas because they have all this talent coming in, Jake. But I think it screams more to the fact that there's more to team building than just bringing in multiple five-star prospects, tossing them on the court and say, go and get it done. Hunter Dickinson, remember, he was the number one guy in the transfer portal 2 years ago. He has been middling, if not lower tier than anybody would have expected coming in from Michigan. And you can kind of point at different guys on that Kansas roster and say, none of them have lived up to expectations.
Yeah, and it all goes back to me to body language. It just did not feel like against Utah too. Like, I watched the end of the Utah game. Hunter Dickinson, for as dominant, quote unquote, as a player, and granted he was not dominant at all this last week, for as dominant and big and tall and lerpy and wide wingspan as a player as he is, like I feel like he should be more involved, right? Like, you remember Jen Hampson for BYU, yes, the women's basketball team, great volleyball player.
Hey, congratulations, Tressa Hampson, her mom, getting her jersey retired this past week by BYU women's basketball. Number 54 is in the rafters. You
would know that.
And
saying. That's a compliment. You like, not surprised. So Jen Hampson, for those that don't know, and I went to school, I was at BYU TV when Jen Hampson was like in her prime. And so like, I'm very familiar with Jen Hampson. She dominated, right? The sheer size, like, she wasn't she wasn't athletic. She wasn't like this dominant force, but she was just tall. And there was like no way to defend. And I'm not saying like just because you're tall, you're going to be good. Like, she obviously had skill. But Hunter Dickinson has shown in the past, like, he's a skillful, tall, big. And he was just like there were moments where I was like, is Hunter even on the floor? Like, Foose was guarding him well. Like, Keita was like, he couldn't do anything against anybody. And for the best player on a preseason number one team, I expected way more out of him. He was 5 of 12, 5 of 13 from the field, 12 points. He just wasn't good. And I said before the Kansas game, I thought if BYU was going to beat Kansas, they had to double team Hunter, which I thought they did a couple times, and they did it well, but they didn't have to. And they had to put Mag on Zeke Mayo, which they did. And that was the recipe for success. And I was like, man, freaking, like, put me on the bench, coach. Like, I got this. Like, I know how to scout these teams. I know how to, but like, it was like such a simple formula to beating Kansas. I didn't believe that it would be that simple, even though that's what I said. But like, that's really all they had to do.
Yeah. Well, and that's a very good point that you make there, is that this is a team that Kansas, they don't have the gravitational pull from any single player that forces you to really adjust for them. And that's a problem. And Bill Self's going to have to address it. And I'm sure that he'll throw a bunch of money in NIL at a bunch of guys. And they have, I forget what his name is. He's that high level recruit that's challenging AJ DeBonsa for the number one spot in the 2026 class. So they're bringing in some high powered talent. But once again, it goes back to, can you get back to building a roster that's a cohesive unit versus a collection of just individual players
that are in? They have got to be interested, right? I think that's what I'm getting at, is like Hunter Dickinson, Zeke Mayo, like they have ballers, right? They have guys that can score, and they've shown in the past like there are blue chip athletes. They just are disinterested in playing, and correct. And I think Bill Self has to fix that. So That said, when you look at Kansas, you look at Arizona.
Mhm.
I'm having a hard time finding a week of basketball. Now, granted, you mentioned that week in 1988, which
Mhm.
I don't remember. I don't know if I was born yet. In fact, I would have been born. I was born in '88. This probably would have happened, well, depending on the season. So 1988, right?
Yeah.
So, is this, in your opinion, the most impressive week of basketball in BYU history?
Considering the caliber of talent versus name brands, I have a hard time saying it's not. We're talking about the Arizona Wildcats and we're talking about the Kansas Jayhawks. Like, we're talking two of the bluest of the blue bloods in college basketball, and you knocked both of them off. Yeah, I can't think of another week in my mind that it is a bigger and more impressive week for BYU basketball, especially considering BYU is now a member of the Big 12 Conference. This is not just non-conference play. This has actual stakes on it.
Yeah, and the only 2 weeks I think you can maybe put against it are when they beat Gonzaga in 2020,
Yeah.
which, by the way, I remember being at that game at the baseline, just shooting the game.
Mhm.
The atmosphere at that game was wild.
Yes.
And do you remember what happened after the news that came down after that game? It wasn't even basketball related. 2020.
2020. Is that the right when no, I'm trying to think. That's not COVID. Was that Rudy Gobert in the COVID deal? Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was before Rudy though. So this was before COVID was like let's shut everything down. Remember
Uh
do you remember there was reports of somebody who tested positive that went to the
yes.
game, and it
Yes.
made like national, at least local news. Like, it was a pretty big deal, and I was like, I was at that game. Like, did I get COVID? I was on the baseline. It's like,
I was there too, and I was looking at where this person was allegedly sitting in those stands, being like, "Was that anywhere near that?" I do remember that. Your good memory on your part.
did they have like his seats? They knew like where he was sitting and everything.
There was a report that came out, I think afterwards, that said that, hey, this person was sitting in this section of the arena, and I remember looking at it and saying, okay, I was across the arena, I'm good. I think that's what the ultimate gist was.
Yeah. So anyway, that game was super, and like the implications of that game were huge because BYU was in the top 25, Gonzaga was top 10, top 15, and I think, and what's sad is that at the end of that season, two things happened. BYU lost to St. Mary's in the WCC tournament, which was a huge bummer, and
Yeah.
then COVID shut the NCAA tournament down because I think that team probably was the and I'm this is just off the cuff, so I'd have to do my research. But first impression, I think that team was the best team since Jimmer Senior year
I,
at BYU.
I would agree.
At
Yeah.
least like in terms of potential, right? The Yoli, they had Toulson, they had Haas. Like I think that team could have made a run at the tournament, and so
Yeah.
it was sad that they couldn't make it. In fact, I think they were even like a 7 seed. Like they had a pretty good seed too. They did like their mock seeding.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm getting way off track. So the other game that I would put on that same level as what happened last week is Jimmer's game against San Diego State in San Diego. I think both games were actually one of the best games in BYU history. But the game on the road in San Diego, the way they dominated San Diego State,
Mm-hmm.
that I would put up there. But those, like you said, those were not Big 12 games, right? That's a WCC game and that's a Mountain West game. And like, yes, they're against top 15, top 10 teams, whereas, Kansas is not and Arizona is not. But like blue blood teams, Big 12 implications, it's like to me that it's like this is the most notable week of BYU basketball that I've witnessed, and I think that most people have witnessed.
It's got to be. I was just kind of racking my brain, and you and I are relatively young. I'm sure you got some old timers out there who'd be like, "Hey, remember back in 9?" Okay, guess what? That's 50 plus years ago. This is Big 12 basketball against two of the bluest of the blue bloods. Yeah, I don't think you can argue against it.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we're going to talk about kind of what this means now going forward because BYU still has 4 games left on the season. We start with Arizona State on Wednesday, a rare Wednesday game. We're used to Tuesday games. We're going to preview Arizona State and also preview West Virginia and talk about what we think about BYU running the table. Is it possible? We'll answer that question coming up on the Loyal Cougars podcast. Looking to get your brand in front of BYU's most engaged fans? The Loyal Cougars podcast and Cougar Board are your perfect match. Cougar Board is the largest online community of BYU fans with thousands of posts every day, The Loyal Cougars podcast is the official podcast of Cougar Board, and we have sponsorship opportunities available for both the podcast and the site. Contact us at sponsorships@loyalcougars.com, and we'll help your message hit home with the Cougar faithful. Again, that's sponsorships@loyalcougars.com. All right, so a relatively easy week, relative in terms of what we just experienced last week for BYU, with Arizona State on the road and West Virginia at home. And initially I thought, BYU struggles so much on the road. Like, this is a game that I'm concerned about. This was last week, right? This is before BYU beat Arizona on the road, and before the big news came about BJ Freeman. Now, BJ Freeman, we know from the last time BYU played, if you don't remember, since they played back in December, it's been a while. BJ Freeman is Arizona State, or was Arizona State's leading scorer, essentially their best player, right? It was reported this week that, and I'll just read the AP report, Arizona State's leading scorer, BJ Freeman, is no longer with the program because of conduct detrimental to the team. A team spokesman confirmed on Sunday. The dismissal follows a turbulent stretch for Freeman, who was ejected in games against Colorado and Arizona during conference play. He was also suspended for the team's road loss to Oklahoma State on February 9th. And ironically enough, I know that's not the word. Ironic police can chill for a second, but ironically enough, they won their last game against Kansas State with him out. I don't think that's sustainable.
Yeah.
And it's perfect timing for BYU because, again, BYU is on the road. I think that was probably the biggest concern I had. And granted, like, they've played really well on the road. They beat West Virginia, and now they beat UCF, West Virginia. Now they've beaten Arizona on the road. So I think the road woes have kind of settled a little bit for BYU. But you take BJ Freeman out of this game, I just don't know if there's any way BYU loses this game, right? Like, they're going to be like a 10 to 15 point favorite, right?
Let's put it this way: if you lose this game, ads can be major egg on your face after the week we just experienced with BYU basketball. Jake. So yeah, you make a very good point. The thing with ASU is Bobby Hurley. Could he be on the hot seat right now? If Utah's making a change, like they're making a change right now, if I'm ASU, are you not considering it yourself? Because Bobby Hurley, all he's done there is kind of be a middling program, even in the Pac-12, and all he's done is kind of jettison multiple guys from this program. You'd think you do your homework on some of these guys before they arrived in Tempe, but hey, nonetheless, it's an interesting situation. ASU's beat up. You're leading scorers off the team. Yeah, this one screams BYU should win this by double digits easy. Yeah,
and I would even argue that BYU is a completely different team than they were back in December. I think back then they were still trying to find their identity. I think Yegor was still kind of the initiator of the offense. I think he still took a ton of shots. And
did we mention that Jaden Quaintance left their last game on crutches, by the way? Like left the arena on crutches, like their big man, their star big man, the young buck who's a freshman. He left post game on crutches. So that's another thing, is they're dealing with major injuries to some of their best remaining players as well.
And Quaintance he's their rim defender, right? Like he's I think third in the conference in blocks. He's averaging 2 blocks a game. Like he is their defensive rim defender. So and here's the thing too, Arizona State, don't get those mixed up. Arizona State already runs a very short rotation. They played 8 guys against BYU last time they played. They played 7 guys against Kansas State in their last game with BJ Freeman off the team. This is an incredibly short rotation. So if Jaden Quaintance can't play, they're in some big trouble. And honestly, this Arizona State game already feels like a foregone conclusion. Now, we've said that before, and BYU has lost some head scratcher games, and so like anything can happen. But this Arizona State team is not good, and regardless of whether or not it's on the road, I feel like BYU should win this game. So let's move on to West Virginia, because West Virginia, obviously a more challenging team, one of the best defensive teams in the conference. We've seen what they're capable of. Now, granted, BYU did beat West Virginia on the road, but the formula, it feels like, to beating West Virginia is putting our best defender, which is Mag, on their best offensive player, which is Javon Small. And if you can shut him down, you essentially you halt their offense for the most. Like you bring their offense to somewhat of a halt. Now, you still have to score on them because, again, they are one of the best defensive teams in the conference. And so if you can score on them, that's how you beat them. They're not going to beat you in a shootout.
Yeah. Well, and that's the best point to be made there is if you can slow them enough, you'll be just fine. I think we already saw evidence of how BYU can beat West Virginia in their previous game. And that's the key to this is they have to make the cross-country trek. I do wonder if they will have their legs underneath them. Now, they're not playing the Utah then BYU situation, if I recall correctly. It's BYU then Utah for West Virginia. But it's a long flight, and we've already seen a bunch of coaches out there. Eric Musselman, most recent one from USC, saying that USC is 2 to 4 games behind the 8 ball because all the travel we have to do. Well, guess what? West Virginia, get ready. You're going to be part of it as well.
So they play at Provo and at Salt Lake, which, as Kansas has shown, that road trip has proven to be a little bit brutal. So I think BYU at home is incredibly tough to beat, right? Like Arizona's beaten them at home. Texas Tech has beaten them at home. And I think that's it, right? And it's like, I think BYU at home is a completely different animal. And so if you play West Virginia, even similarly to the way you played them on the road, I think this is kind of another foregone conclusion that I think BYU is going to win. So that said, BYU has a good chance of going into next week, firmly in the top 25, firmly in the field, at least, bracketology field. So the question then becomes, can BYU run the table? And if they win their 2 games this week, they head to Iowa State. And I thought at Arizona, at Iowa State, I thought those were penciled in as losses. But having seen BYU really turn things against Arizona, I don't know. Well, if that's a foregone conclusion now.
I look at it. BYU's proven they can beat anybody. Now, they do have some extra motivation with that Iowa State game, Jake, is the fact that if they beat Iowa State, it could come down to that could be for the 4 seed and the double bye in the Big 12 tournament. So you're right. The question is, can they run the table? I think at minimum they got to go 3-1. And the really only major question mark I have is that road trip to Ames.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think worst case scenario, BYU should finish the season 3-1 with 3 wins. And considering where they were, 4 weeks ago, having lost to TCU, having lost to Utah, like they've turned it around, and they're going to be a tough out in the Big 12 tournament, and I think in the NCAA tournament.
Yeah, they're coming. Like I said earlier, they're coming into their own at the right time. This is when you want a team to peak, and they should be, as you mentioned, a tough out come the Big 12 tournament, come the NCAA tournament, and yes, they got to go 3-1 down the stretch here at minimum.
Special thanks to Jake Hatch for hopping on. We apologize for the technical difficulties. If you want to hear more from Jake, he does a phenomenal job of covering BYU on a daily basis. Head on over to Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to the Locked On Cougars podcast. For now, this is the Loyal Cougars podcast. I'm your host, Jake Edmonds. And again, special thanks to Jake Hatch. We'll see you next week.